Okay, we're back for our second Staying the Course session. And as I mentioned before, our three CEOs for the first session were sort of trading war stories of how terrible the crisis had been for their businesses. I think the two people we're going to hear from now, Nassim Taleb and Ian Bremmer, are from the group that has had rather a good war, as it were. The pundits and the commentators who really... well, the Financial Times, we're sort of on both ends. Journalism-wise, it's kind of a good war for us, but we are not immune to the economic impacts of the crisis, Nassim. But I think that it's fair to say that for Nassim and for Ian, this has been a good crisis in that they have really been among the leading commentators about and predictors of some of the events that have swept through the world, and that's why I'm particularly delighted to be hearing from them. Just before we begin, I wanted to make one observation, which is that Nassim and Ian have one, I think, at least one important thing in common. Nassim, growing up, experienced the war in Lebanon, and Ian, who I first met in 1992, like me, was a very close observer of the collapse of communism and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of my personal theories of this moment of great economic discontinuity in the world is that it's something quite unfamiliar to most of us who have lived these very prosperous Western lives. I think that people like Nassim and Ian might be a little bit better equipped than many of us are for the possibility of radical change and even radical worsening of conditions. We're going to run this conversation much as we did the previous one, where I'll ask Nassim some questions for 15 minutes or so, then I'll ask Ian questions for 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for you to ask questions. One of our two panelists said to me beforehand that Europeans are very bad at asking questions, and that's why there was such a pathetic response earlier today. So I'm now appealing to your continental pride in preparing some probing questions after we've had an initial discussion. I wanted to start by asking Nassim about an idea of his, which really, and this is sort of a rare honor for a thinker to have a concept that enters the language, and that concept is, of course, Nassim's idea of the black swan, which I now see people referring to all the time. I wanted to ask Nassim if you could just define briefly for us this notion of a black swan event.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm honored to be here for one simple reason. When I was asked, when I described first, when nobody cared about black swans, to describe a black swan and to give an example of a modern black swan, you know what my example was? What do you think it was?
No idea.
Google.
Google is a black swan. Okay. I thought black swans are bad.
At no time in the history of the world did someone go from zero to the most powerful, sorry to say that, but the most powerful company in the world, from college dorms to Google in no time. It happened very quickly, which tells you something about the environment, the complexity of the environment in which we live. So black swans are not necessarily bad, but so Google is a positive black swan. The internet, I'm still not sure whether it's positive or negative, but it definitely is a black swan. Now, okay, so what is a black swan? Just like the bird was an exception, nobody thought it existed. I defined black swan, capitalizing black and swan, as an event that is both unexpected, based on information, or by some observers, and of very high impact. It doesn't have a high probability of taking place, like a discovery. You have hundreds and thousands of people searching, and discoveries have low probability of taking place. However, when these take place, there can be a massive impact. So that's my definition of black swan. And I discovered something else which drew me into psychology, because I said, how come people don't realize that the world is dominated by black swans more and more? What kind of mental disorder makes us ignore these? What kind of education are we getting at school that makes us narrate backwards history to make it like smooth and understandable when history is completely dominated by black swans?
And do you think we as humans are bad at noticing black swan events?
We are bad at understanding the concept, at understanding how little we know, because we tend to overestimate knowledge. We have this chronic inability to accept that there is uncertainty, that there is that much we don't know and that little we know. And especially intelligent people. Anyone who, now I'm starting to study autism and IQ and research on systematizing minds, and I realize that people who are excellent engineers are people who are not capable of understanding uncertainty. And IQ tests, you have 4 questions, all right, multiple choice questions, 4 questions, and there's no ambiguity, right? There's only one answer. The real world is vastly different. So, the reason is that not only we humans have a propensity to not want to understand uncertainty, but that our lack of understanding of uncertainty seems to increase with what we call IQ, which tells you that people at the top don't quite get that.
The smarter we are, the less good we are at understanding this crucial
Uncertainty,
thing.
and there's some blindness to some concept. Like number one, history is not smooth. In history books, of course, it's narrated backwards, and we have explanation of why something happened after the fact. But before the fact, it's not smooth. And it jumps. It doesn't crawl. Yet when we read history books, it's smoothed out, made to be very linear, just like a novel. It's not. The world is not like that. So it makes us underestimate what can happen, underestimate how bad changes can be, or how positive they can be, and how quickly they can occur. Now, the Soviet Union, of course, is something, this transformation took place very quickly. But think of the First War. Think of Europe in 1913 versus Europe a few years later. It was unrecognizable, okay? And that's one of 1,500 black swans you can see in history. So we're living now one, and you have, of course, positive black swan, the good ones, like Google, of course, and discoveries and the virtuous things that are unexpected. And then you have negative black swans, the first war, and the crisis that has not really started, in my opinion, because negative black swans tend to cascade.
The crisis hasn't really
has
started.
Not really started. In my opinion,
it's
just the beginning.
Optimism of our car and phone and retailer guys, they're wrong. It's going to get worse.
Okay, yeah. Think about it. Why do we have to listen to anyone? Okay, given that there were close to 1 million people officially defined as economists in the world. 1 million people with how many trillion of pieces of information? How many textbooks? How many of them saw the dinosaur in the room that were sitting on a pile of dynamite with this debt level and this hidden risk by banks? How many? 5 out of 1 million? These are the people who define themselves as economists. Plus you have the journalists, the commentators, people who think they can understand the world. And these probably have to add another 30, 40 million people. Okay. So here we have a pool of close to 40 million people. And how many saw the elephant in the middle of the room? All right. So we got a problem, collectively and individually. Sometimes the cab drivers individually may detect that there's something wrong with this hidden risk, with the tripling of debt levels, with a world that has changed dramatically. The world has become less predictable because of complexity. Like Google was not something that anyone predicted. And had you predicted Google in 1992, I think even before or even after that, if you told them these college dorms people are going to have a company that's going to run the world, people would have called an ambulance right away, all right? And now we don't really, and then we continue trying to predict the future, not realizing that events that are dominating the world today were not predictable.
Okay, so now I'm going to go back to a point you've made, Nassim. You've just told us that it's very difficult and dangerous to predict the future, but you made a powerful prediction a moment ago that this is just the beginning of the crisis.
Okay.
So this is on YouTube. We can all go back a year or two from now, see if Nassim was right.
So
what's going to happen?
Okay, let me give you the reasoning I had before the crisis, and it still applies today. I said people can't really predict black swans, but I can identify who is more fragile to them. The Western economies, particularly because of that, were a lot more fragile in my eyes, particularly that you had anything that's built on methods, statistical methods analyzing the past, anything. Number one, the economic establishment is completely incompetent because I showed in the Black Swan that the risk methods are like astrology, without the elegance, of course, right? So here you have someone flying a plane, not realizing there can be storms. Can't you predict that that plane eventually will crash? That's exactly what that was my reasoning. I'm looking at the data and facts on a table, and I see absolutely nothing has changed. We're still flying the plane.
Haven't we seen some crashes?
Listen,
haven't we all adapted? I mean, I bet you everyone here has adapted their personal behaviors and their professional behaviors quite radically.
Look at
in the past year.
Look at the top. You still have Greenspan, Bernanke, the other guy, right? Bernanke, who patently incompetent because he called it the Great Moderation when we had this huge built-up of hidden risk by banks. It was an elephant in the room.
But he's changed his behaviors.
Same
guy, but he's doing different things.
I mean, how can you have in charge the pilot who crashed the plane still running the show? And there's stable economic establishment, and now after the fact they're doing theories. Let me continue, all right? It's worse. You have Obama building a budget, all right?
He's new. You can't say Americans didn't change their president.
He has this clique of incompetent people around him, okay? And he has this budget, okay?
The clique would be Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, those people.
You know what? I want to name names. Yes, all right? So it's on YouTube.
Thank you.
I want to name names. And these people don't realize they're using the wrong tools, okay? That the fragility of these projections that we have on which we depend, okay? The fragility. In other words, if you don't have the growth they think we're going to get, think of what would happen to the budget deficit in the United States. That's number one. Number two, they're fitting their stress testing. I don't know if you've heard that banks did stress testing, okay? Now, that would be the equivalent.
If you haven't, go back and read your back copies of the Financial Times.
Of course. There's something called stress testing. That stress testing is equivalent of taking a bridge and having a truck drive on it. Now, how do you stress test? An engineer knows that you don't stress test that way. It's not a real stress test. The system is very fragile. So what may happen is two things. Either these events, I mean, they think we're going to have recovery because in the past recessions have had recovery. This is a completely different world. They don't understand it. It may be that we are in a world that resembles what we've seen before, but there's a very high probability of it being wrong. If we're wrong, two things can happen. Massive deflation. In other words, you have a total collapse and their policies are not going to go anywhere. Or they're going to have massive budget deficits. Okay? The world today doesn't resemble, I mean, the more you study economics, the less competent one is going to be at understanding what's going to come next. Okay? They assume we're in a depression. The world's different. Two examples I gave. The first one is you have this device called BlackBerries. I'm sure about half of you have one, all right? Okay, I'm sure, or I know 9%, okay, but of course you don't use it now. That BlackBerry bankrupted Iceland because things happen.
Why is it the fault of this nice Canadian company that Iceland would go broke?
Because in the past, you did not, you have fads in economic life. Economic life is based on crowd movements and fads and things like that. When you had in the past, when you used to have runs on a bank, these would happen in a very progressive and slow way. It will take a long time, and it gives you enough time to change your mind because you're going to have to take a bus to go and take your money out, okay? Today, you bankrupt the country, you can take your money out using BlackBerry, you see? So you can have a planetary-wide fad take place. Like the Harry Potter mechanism could not have taken place in Victorian England, you see? Not the whole planet reading the same book. So,
you did have whole countries, right? Charles Dickens existed pre-internet.
I understand, but the whole world did not read Charles Dickens at the time. So you don't have that planetary-wide effect that gives you big spikes. So these big spikes create more uncertainty. It's very hard to predict the behavior of economic variables. So that's the first one. Is what I mean is the internet and this interlocking relationship between countries make variables take more extreme values. And this is easy to show mathematically. Okay, another example is that cancellation of orders in New York because the internet, we have so much interlocking relationship. Cancellation at order in Bloomingdale's can lead to a shutdown of a factory in China within hours, okay? We never had that before. So things react very quickly. It makes for more unpredictability. That's the first one. The second one, that today, it looks like a lot of this economic growth was fluff. So numbers can go down a lot more. How many cars, how many cars do people need to buy? How many flat screen TVs you need to buy? All you need is your laptop and a little bit of fresh water and some protein, all right? So it's not like, so you can cut economic, so we built.
I'm sure Google will be pleased that you included a laptop along with water as one of the necessities.
Before the water,
Yeah.
okay. So you have this huge economic growth based, it's much more fragile because people can compress their expenditure a lot more than we did in the 30s. So you can fall, GDP can fall a lot more. So why using the past as indication? The past is not, okay, similar to the present. So these are the elements. Now, just based on, I would have been a lot more optimistic had I seen governments understand the complexity of the world. But I spent some time in Davos, and I came back wondering what was going on, because I thought before Davos that we really had people in charge who knew what was going on. And I was shocked. I was completely taken aback by, it's like people falling off a cliff, off a mountain, and they're looking at how they're going to miraculously rise back up instead of looking at where we're falling into because they're too scared. We're falling into something we have never seen before. So this makes me a lot more negative on the system because the system is very fragile. So you either going to have massive deflation or hyperinflation. Governments are not really in charge.
Now, I'm feeling now, as I usually feel when I read what Nassim has written or I talk to him, the same sort of scary but pleasant thrill of watching a horror movie or reading, one of the Grimm's brothers' children's stories. So there's a pleasure to it, but also a fear. I want to try, since I've come from optimistic New York yesterday, to move you to, in a final question, maybe a more positive, what can we do with this knowledge? So if we are accepting this notion of black swans and integrating it into our thinking, how useful is it? What can we do about it? You say these are rare events. You say they are very hard to predict. So how can we make actual use of this idea?
Yeah, thanks to the Financial Times, who saw value in my idea of having 10 principles. I said 10 principles for a black swan robust world, which suddenly was changed by the Financial Times from robust to free, black swan free world. You guys are a lot more optimistic than I am. But I mean, you need to build robustness.
Sensationalize a little bit.
You need to build robustness to the black swan. Negative black swan, you have negative black swan, you need to be robust to them while open to positive black swans. What may come out, this crisis is
so
not that bad.
So we need to create a system which can endure negative black swan
events?
Exactly.
Nature, I always use biology as my model. Biology doesn't have too big to fail. The largest animal out there is what? Is either an elephant or a
whale?
A blue whale, all right? If we went here on an expedition to kill time and shot an elephant or a blue whale, I don't think it would matter much for the ecology of the planet, no? That's the biggest one, okay? So there's nothing too big to fail. But if we went and shot down a bank, and that's like Lehman Brothers, for example, you know what can happen, all right? So you need to build a system that is more resilient to, for long run, biology cleans up these things. So what we're witnessing here is simple, very simple evolutionary rules cleaning up people. The only problem is that instead of bankrupting the economic establishment, we're still keeping these people in place to make more mistakes. That's what makes me negative. So we should build a world that resembles the biological environment with no too big to fail, no moral hazard. In other words, bankers make a lot of money and they keep the bonuses, but when they lose, it's socialism. We pay for their losses, but so it's privatizing profits and socializing losses. No vicious incentives to do that. Another thing I was suggesting is to definancialize the economic life, because a lot of the growth we've seen comes from financial hype, okay, that eventually you're going to pay for. I mean, nature doesn't like that. The other concept is leverage. Nature hates leverage. Nature does the opposite of leverage. And the typical example I give is something called functional redundancy. Nature likes redundancy, which is the opposite of leverage. So if banks had capital on the side, they would be still here. And now I'd be talking about positive black swans and how great Google is. But unfortunately, banks don't get the point. So I mean, the economic life has the opposite of redundancy. And economists would say, well, this is idle capital. Like someone saying you have, well, 2 eyes, have one is too much. Let's take it out. It's inefficient, okay? So give it to someone else, all right? You have 2 of them. You only need one. There you go. 2 kidneys. Why kidney? 2 kidneys. Spare parts are heavy. So we need to understand redundancy, and it actually ensures survival in the long run. And finally, the governments have not been able, have been propping up fragile things that should break. Let things break, and break quickly. So in a way, I think there's a silver lining.
Should we let them break when they're big, or break
we should
when they
learn what the Citibank was prevented from going bust in 1982. Has Citibank or Continental Illinois or other banks, money center banks, gone bust in 1982, I think bankers would have a little more IQ, right? Unfortunately,
break things when they're small.
Break things when they're small, okay? But remember one thing, and here, since we have the Google people here, that why debt is bad and why there is an environment, economic life, that does very well without debt. Think of the bubble of 2000, okay? Nobody really suffered. We had no debt. Capitalism functions, all right, by fads, okay? Let fads develop. They're harmless when they're financed by equity. They're very harmful when financed by debt. So we have a model right in front of us, okay? Just remove the economists and look at how biologists understand the world, and you'll see it's very obvious, very simple, okay? It works well. Capitalism, competition does a good job. Once you have someone on top trying to fiddle with it, like saving banks, like Greenspan, messing with systems, then we should learn, look at hedge funds, okay? Well, I think that if we replace banks with hedge funds, are we subsidizing any hedge fund today? Yet you have hundreds, actually thousands that failed. No, we're just subsidizing big dinosaurs, banks. But hedge funds, like restaurants, are ecologically sound because they go bust without making the papers. You want a system where no company would go bust and make it to page 1 of the Financial Times. Maybe page 25 if you guys have room that day, all right?
Okay, well, since Nassim is depriving me of great headlines by creating a vision of a world where bankruptcies don't make the front page, I can't resist reminding you all that if you want his 10 rules for a black swan-free economy, they're all available on our website. He wrote a great piece about it. And now I'm going to turn to Ian. Ian, what I wanted to start by talking to you about is one of the big themes of your new book, The Fat Tail, which is about the contribution of politics to instability. We've all been necessarily, I think inevitably, focused on economics and finance right now. What about politics? Does political risk still exist? Is it playing a role in all of this?
Well, I mean, fortunately, I don't need to discuss that one too much anymore because I think, I used to have to justify my existence and saying, why does politics matter? When I first started going to Wall Street back in 1997, 98, they said, you're an interesting guy, but we don't hire political scientists. We have economists and strategists and physicists to talk about all this. So increasingly, the big political risks and the big political upsides were thought of as black swans. And my point is that actually they're not black swans, they're gray swans, or maybe they're blue whales. They're things that are really, really large, but that we can get our hands around. And I think there are 2 structural changes that we've been experiencing over the last years that have contributed to the increase in importance in politics of the global markets. The first on the geopolitical side is just that look where energy is coming from. It's increasingly unstable parts of the world. That's structural. So it's not the North Sea, which is becoming more mature, in the Gulf of Mexico. It's the Persian Gulf, right? And dangerous technologies are becoming more diffuse, so rogue states and organizations have more capacity to create market volatility. If we're talking about ballistic missile technology or improvised explosive devices or nuclear weapons, right? I mean, Moore's law applies to them as well. That's one area. But now we're seeing the second area, and the second area really brings this home to everyone, which is that the rise of state capitalism matters. It's been coming for a long time, but globalization's been more important. So over the last 20 years, there was one thing you could not afford to miss, and that was that multinational corporations were increasingly taking advantage of global markets of scale, maximizing profitability, sometimes short-term, to our chagrin, sometimes long-term. But that was the story. And at the same time, you had national oil corporations becoming more important, rise of OPEC and the oil shock. Then you had emerging markets becoming more important, and state-owned enterprises and privately owned national corporations growing with that. And then you had the rise of sovereign wealth funds. They've been around for decades, but there was no term sovereign wealth fund until 5 years ago. And then you had September and Lehman going under. And suddenly, the places that were important were the governmental capitals, the political capitals, not the commercial capitals. So we used to make money in Dubai, now Abu Dhabi is going to determine who the winners and losers are. I live in New York. We used to think that was the financial capital of the world. It's no longer the financial capital of the United States. Washington is, right? And the same thing is going on from Shanghai to Beijing and on and on. This challenge, which Lord Mandelson talked about this morning, and he's hoping that we can somehow resolve it, is that there is increasingly going to be a very strong, in some cases a primary role, played by the state in determining who the winners and losers are. Now, I happen to believe that in the United States and in Great Britain and other developed states, that's a relatively temporary phenomenon. We'll go back to business more or less as usual, staying the course. But I also think that China is going to stay the course as well. And the Chinese governmental response to this crisis, and they're first out of the recession globally, has been our system works. I was talking to a Chinese delegation on Friday, and the head of the delegation, pretty senior guy, came over to me and said, so Ian, what do we learn? What lessons do we learn about the right role of the state in the economy, given that the Western model has failed? We need to be able to answer that question, and we need to answer it in the context of a G20, not a G7 or a G8. That's going to be challenging for us.
And do you think that point of view is also being heard in the West? We heard Mr. Bernabe in the previous panel talking about, very admiringly about how the Chinese response to the crisis had been more forceful and quicker than that of democracies. I often hear on Wall Street, actually, a sort of very odd to hear from Americans, but a sort of yearning for authoritarianism and kind of wishing that the government could act quickly, ruled by technocrats who think about the long term in the way that the Chinese do. Do you think that we're seeing that sort of a political influence on everybody else?
Short term. I mean, clearly in the United States, the model has been the government that governs best is the one that governs least, and the state is coming back. But I also believe that right now, Western governments are caught up in their own stuff, right? So a lot of Americans aren't really thinking about the Chinese model. In fact, one of the silver linings of this crisis has been that Americans aren't blaming anyone but themselves for the crisis. They're not blaming the Chinese, they're not blaming the Gulf, they're not blaming the Russians. They're actually blaming greed and lack of regulatory policy. And they said, okay, we got carried away with ourselves, and now we need to focus on the US. But there's not a lot of bandwidth in Washington right now to do global, right? I mean, when Obama won the election, but before he actually took on the presidency, he was in Hawaii, and he was asked, at that point, the Israelis were engaging in the bombing invasion of Gaza, and he was asked what he thought about the Bush response. He said, there's only one president at a time. I don't want to comment on that. Now, I don't remember him saying that when he was asked about the response to GM and bankruptcy, because we've got priorities. The United States has priorities. The Europeans have priorities. And we are increasingly in an environment where we're going to see an absence of global leadership. The Chinese don't like the G2 concept any more than the Americans do because it implies responsibility and blame. And right now they want to just kind of stick to their knitting and get their economy moving and as fast as they possibly can. But I think that what we're going to see is that on the major global challenges, whether we're talking about collective security in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, whether we're talking about preventing nuclear proliferation, whether we're talking about dealing with climate change, or whether we're talking about creating effective global financial architecture, we are going to see an absence of leadership, which is going to create an inability to deal with significant crises as they hit until they become
at a global level.
At a global level. At a global. I mean, one of the things that Rahm Emanuel said.
So you weren't excited by the G20, everybody coming together, this beautiful tableau, a more concerted international response than we've seen previously?
I was very excited, but I'm easily excited. You know, I mean, I'm a political scientist. You know, it's youth. It's youth. It's really youth. I thought the G20, I mean, I was in London, I met with a lot of the delegations. I mean, I'll say that, you know, I talked to the Japanese delegation on the sidelines, and they were like, you know, we got one sentence in that was translated, and we didn't believe the trade credit was going to work, but we did it because everyone else wanted us to. They were all talking about free trade, but they're all actually putting protectionist legislation, 17 of the 20 that showed up had been actually implementing those policies. We've all seen the FT headlines on that. But yeah, look,
but it's not the Great Depression.
No, it's not the Great Depression.
It's not Smoot-Hawley,
and that's,
right?
but that's in a sense that's precise. It's precisely the fact that it's not the Great Depression that means that we can go on with business as usual. I mean, the big lie here is not that the G2 is bad; it's that it's a kludge. No one's talking about creating new effective architecture. We're dealing with the IMF because that's what we have. I think that when Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief of staff, came out and he said, this crisis is too great an opportunity for us not to take advantage of. He's wrong, because there's a lot of complacency in the United States. Republicans and Democrats are engaging in politics as usual. It takes just as much time to get political appointees confirmed in the Department of Treasury. This is not an American government that believes that this is the end of times. It's an American government that believes it's a serious recession, and we'll get through it, and then we'll kind of go back to business as usual.
So is your bottom line, Ian, as bleak as Nassim's, that the crisis is actually worse than we think, and it's going to get worse before it gets better?
No. My bottom line probably is more optimistic than that, though I think that there's going to be greater social instability as, in particularly emerging and frontier markets, that's a lagging indicator, and that will create some crises. I mean, if I'm talking to corporate executives today, I say your 5-year scenarios are useless, unless you're talking about demographics or military spending. If you want to talk about economic and political development and stability, you need to look at 12, 18 months, and you need to recognize that your breadth of potential scenarios and discontinuities vastly greater than it used to be because of the potential impact of these lagging impact of social revolution, instability, radicalism, and the rest. But I also think it's precisely because it's not that bad, and from a political perspective, and because American and European and Japanese institutions are so stable that we don't want to see lots of strong changes that will allow us to take real pain. In other words, the one thing I really strongly agree with Nassim on is the fact that we're not going to allow things to start crashing when they're small, because the American government is not prepared to stand by and watch the American consumers and citizens take real pain. And we absolutely saw that with the initial stimulus right before the election. Unfortunately, they happened at the same time, where you had congressmen that were saying, we're not going to pass this because we're about to run. Give us another $125 billion in earmarks, please, so we can make sure our own constituents are happy. This was not a sense of urgency. This was a sense of, we're going through our electoral process.
Okay, I would like to ask you whether you don't think that the fact that Chrysler actually was allowed to go bankrupt doesn't somewhat contradict that view, you know, a company being allowed to fail. But we have 5 minutes left for questions. So are you guys going to do a better job than you did in the first session and actually ask a few questions? Anyone want to challenge the idea that things are really dreadful?
I have a question for Nassim. And first of all, I think your book is brilliant and at least as self-confident as you are. So if 1 million economists, I'm Andreas Wieler with the German publisher Axel Springer, if 1 million economists were wrong, if the Davos leadership is falling off the cliff, and if we are just in the middle of the horror movie, I don't quite see the good guy who's going to save us at the end, and your suggestions how to do that sounded good in theory, but how can they actually be put into action in reality?
It's a very good question, because to think that that we need to implement things, and people go immediately to the state to implement things. But I have some news about that state. When I was hearing, let me tie it in with what Ian was saying. When I hear people talk about nation state and governments, they just don't realize that in the Google age, governments are becoming increasingly irrelevant because the nation state is dead. Think about it. George Bush nationalized the banks. Okay, so what can governments do? They can have an army to go invade some country with pictures, all right? And they can control the flow of people into their country. But now we have free flow of information and we have free flow of money. What did it lead to? It led to the United States, okay, depending on UBS not going bust. Because had UBS gone bust, can you imagine the consequences in the United States? Be vastly greater than Lehman, okay? So where's the nation state? Given the absence of nation state, who's going to implement anything, you see? We're caught in a model of nation states in a world that we created that has Google information flowing across borders and money nobody owned, nobody knows. Do you know where this glass was made? Probably can't figure it out. Not even China. China programmed by someone in Russia or something, all right? And this was the artist in Venice, probably, all right? Just who designed it, okay? So you don't know. The nation state is pretty much, we killed the nation state and kept governments, okay? We don't have so this is a problem. Who's going to implement it? Definitely not the IMF, all right? Definitely not these guys. There are too many PhDs in economics and too many charlatans, all right? So definitely not these super organizations. I don't know, I'm very pessimistic.
I'm just going to ask
Yeah.
Ian to very quickly respond to this notion that the nation state is over, because Ian was telling us that we're actually seeing the rise of state capitalism, which suggests to me that the nation state is very much alive and well. So why is Nassim wrong?
Well, I mean, I think he's not wrong about globalization and where things are made, but in terms of capital flows, certainly governments in many parts of the world are trying to reassert themselves. I look at sovereign wealth funds in a place like Abu Dhabi. Used to have the portfolio managers trained in the West that determined how to allocate capital on the basis of what would be maximally profitable. Now they're capital constrained. Those guys have been marginalized or fired, and the political leaders are determining where to put their money. And by the way, number one is Dubai to ensure it's stable. Number two is the other Emirates, like Ras Al Khaimah, to make sure they're not too annoyed. And then we're looking at the GCC. And then they start looking at maximizing profitability. Same thing's happening in Russia. Same thing's happening in China. In Russia, have we seen greater consolidation of the state over the economy over the last 10 years? I'd certainly say yes. In China, I would suggest we're now seeing the state starting to assert itself more, because as a consequence of this crisis, a lot of companies have gone bankrupt, but most of those companies are ones that aren't very big and they're not very connected to the central government. In fact, I would argue China is becoming more state capitalist now, and we're just starting to see the tipping point, not less. We'll look back in 5 or 10 years on YouTube and see if we're right. But I say, we know Google has problems with the Chinese state. Now, it may well be that Google's problems with the Chinese state flow from a Chinese nationalism that actually exists among the Chinese citizenry. That's a bigger argument that we can talk about, whether technology is really decentralizing and democratizing, or whether it's just a multiplier that actually brings forth what the culture would absolutely want for themselves. I love that content. But the real question is, there are a lot of states out there that believe that even if long-term they're dead, right now they seem to be doing okay. And most investors aren't looking 20 years. Most investors, if we're lucky, are looking 20 minutes. And so as a consequence, for these 20 minutes, I think the nation state is actually on the bounce.
Okay, we'll take a quick final question, please.
So yes, it's another question for Nassim. So if it follows from your book, from reading your book, The Black Swan, that using computer simulation for forecasting is most often a pointless exercise, as you mentioned. If you have a complex system, because of the possibility of black swans, the forecasting won't work. The question is, what do you think about computer simulation as games, as in the war game tradition, as a way to train and to get prepared? You quote Louis Pasteur, luck favors those who are well prepared, and I could quote, since you are a philosopher, François Julien, and his comparison of Greek and Chinese philosophy, and which is also based on the idea that forecasting is futile, but being prepared counts. So do you think that there is another venue for computer simulation as games?
Yeah, definitely. It is necessary to do counterfactuals and to simulate by computers. The problem is the forecast you get today, like Social Security or oil prices, people produce a point estimate, okay? And as I wrote in the Black Swan, don't cross a river if it's on average 4 feet deep, right? Because you need a lot more richer information than one point estimate, okay? What roads, what scenarios can lead you there? So it definitely would be much enriching. Point estimates are dangerous. Scenario analysis can be dangerous because it closes your mind to things you have not simulated for. There's a psychological element that people take more risk after scenario analysis. But if you did there are a lot of complexity theorists who do simulations, not necessarily to forecast what will happen, but to perturbate systems to see what may happen. That is, it's a necessity, but I haven't seen it implemented very much.
Okay, I'm afraid that we're going to have to bring it to a conclusion there, with apologies to any economists in the audience. I'm sorry that you've taken such a beating. Rest assured that financial journalists have also been beaten up quite a lot recently, and probably the worst off are investment bankers. I don't know if we have any here, but you're the guys who have been flogged the most in the public arena. And I would like to really thank Nassim and Ian. I personally could have listened to their views for at least another hour, but the good news is we can all read their books. So thank you very, very much.
By the way, you called me economist.